Everything we saw in week 8 and where we are in the fantasy football season. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter, bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, some weeks we, before the show, kind of talk through the different topics, how we want to approach the things we want to talk about. We always have plenty that we want to talk about. The listeners know that. But this week, we have a lot. There's so much we can discuss. We want to start with week 8 and focus on that. There's obviously so much we can do to cover the games. We didn't do our Sunday night show. We are not going to be doing it for the foreseeable future, just scheduling stuff the way that we're going to approach it going forward, which means that these Wednesday morning shows that we're recording now, after I've had the chance to write Stealing Signals, you've had the chance to work through some of your early week stuff, which changes a little bit week to week, what you're actually writing about. But obviously doing a ton of research on the games as well gives us even more ability to dive into these games. So it's like it can be even longer than our Sunday night shows already. And then there's so much interesting stuff about where we're at in the season that we're going to get into probably in a future show. Because the first thing I want to say at the top is we have to kind of like not go super long in our recording today because Ben has a dentist appointment here in about 90 minutes. So we're going to pack in whatever we can into about an hour. Sometimes we go an hour and a half. That could be, we're going to focus on week 8, but that could be a lot of really intricate topics. The things that we don't get to, I just want to assure the listeners, Shawn, before we get going, we will in our future upcoming episodes. We have so much. We've just kind of tugged on a few of these threads before we started recording here today and didn't really get into them a lot, but I can just tell that there's a lot that we could really get into. There's so much fun stuff to think about as far as the way that 2024 is playing out, in a macro sense for fantasy football, what that means going forward. And then the way it's playing out in the NFL. I mean, that was one of the things that you said to me as we jump into week 8. We got a fun week again. We got some points, and I dug into it a little bit in my intro at Stealing Signals. People were talking about how scoring was way down at the beginning of this year. I'm just going to give you the average team point total per week so far this year. 22.9 the first game, which is reasonably close to normal. 19.8 and 20.8 the next 2 weeks. And so after week 3, we were talking about how there's just not been much scoring, right? 22.8 in week 4, and then 24.4, 24.6, only 21.6 in week 7. That was the week before this past weekend when all the running backs scored and all the receivers didn't. And then we were back this week to 24.4. 3 of the last 4 weeks have been above 24. From a season-long perspective, Shawn, that has brought points per game for NFL teams back in line with pre-2022, because that's a stat that we've referenced before and talked about, and I went into that a little bit in my intro, but the last year we were at 21.8 points per game per team. The year prior, 21.9. Those were about a full point down from 2021, which was 23.0. So we dropped all the way below 22 points per game. This is per team game. So there's it's a large sample. When you see a full point swing, that's pretty meaningful. The NFL record is 24.8, which is that 2020 season. It was a scoring bonanza. If we set that aside, the NFL record is actually only 23.4. And we've only hit 23 per game 5 times in NFL history. So there's a little bit of context. And the last 2 years, we've been below 22 per game. 3 of the last 4 weeks, Shawn, we've been above 24 per game, which means that what that's meant for the 2024 total, through week 3, we were at 21.1, which is almost a full point down from even the last 2 years that were down a point from prior. We are now back all the way. These last 5 weeks, particularly weeks 5, 6, and 8, have brought us all the way back to where this season's average is 22.7, which is basically, I just said we've only hit 23 5 times in NFL history. In just the last few 5 weeks, we've hit 23.6. I'll just do a bunch of numbers at people, but the point is, scoring has been back for a good month now. Week 7 was a bummer where the receivers didn't score. Week 8, it came back. We did see some receivers score. We also saw some more receiver injuries, which is not going to help. We see Stephon Diggs get hurt. He's out for the year. But a fun week, broadly, is sort of the landscape. I threw a bunch of numbers at the listeners. Again, didn't expect you to listen to all that. people are pulling over their cars so they can pull out a pen and paper to try to figure out what the heck I just said. I apologize for throwing so many numbers at you in the first 5 minutes of the podcast, but the broad takeaway, week 8 was a lot like week 5 and 6, not so much like week 7 in terms of team scoring. In the last month overall, because 3 of the 4 weeks have been good, is there's been a lot of scoring in the NFL, which has been fun.
It's been fun to see the teams score. Still, in many ways, frustrating to see how they're scoring. Frustrating, I think, for me personally, to lose key quarterbacks early-ish in games in consecutive weeks. That's definitely catastrophic especially when the scoring levels are high, because it's harder to cover. At the same time, but anytime that you're running hot, and by running hot, obviously mean getting super lucky with the kicker and scoring, then you feel like that's a skill as opposed to being really random. Watching Monday Night Football and Russell Wilson bogging down in the red zone every time was very exciting, because Chris Boswell, very highly represented on those stealing bananas teams. Him and the fantastic Washington kicker, who did miss a kick, that was too bad, but to have all of those guys, and then Ben, we had the Detroit Lions defense on almost every squad this past week. I don't know if it jumps out of the numbers that you have there, but I am interested in how many of the scores are weird one-offs, because the quality of play, the experience of watching games has certainly been good. We've also gotten maybe some more special teams types of contributions. If you're playing the Lions defense and special teams, every time they had a 60-yard return and then somehow failed to get in, you're thinking, why are we giving all these 3-yard touchdowns to the different Detroit Lions players? Now, that's also exciting, because obviously we're very heavily represented in Lions.
But the Lions game, Sean, I opened that right up at Stealing Signals with, what an absurd football game. Just genuinely one of the most insane football games you will ever see. I went through a lot of what you're alluding to, and I finished by saying this bullet, seen a lot of stuff, but I'm pretty sure this was the single most unique offensive game I've seen in the 8 years I've been writing this column. As far as there being one-off stuff, the Lions one was a very one-off, is all I want to chime in to say.
It was pretty humorous looking through the different stats there, because Jared Goff, who I continue to believe is the MVP, especially after Lamar Jackson managed to captain his team to a loss against the Cleveland Browns, in which they leaned into throwing against an elite Browns pass defense and not into using Derrick Henry against a mediocre Browns run defense. Interesting tactics there. And then they're like, we lost because Rashad Bateman and Nelson Aguilar dropped those passes. We better acquire someone that the Carolina Panthers are like, we would pay you to take Deontay Johnson off of our hands. Jared Goff had a 15 QBR, which that's not what you usually get from a quarterback on a team who put up 52 points and could have scored 90. Right. I mean, could have easily scored 90 if they had wanted. I mean, at some point, so the Lions kind of do this thing where in the third quarter and early fourth, they're running all of their trick plays, and it has a little bit the sense of mocking the opponent. But I mean, again, it's a competition. You're playing against NFL teams. They need to hold up their end of it, and it's entertainment, right? There's a limit to how early in the game you can really shut it down and have delivered to the consumers who paid for that game in a variety of different ways. One of my takeaways is that there are some teams that David Montgomery could play quarterback for. That was a good pass. Right. Sam Laporta is like, if David Montgomery were quarterback, I wouldn't be the biggest tight end bust of all time. Man, this was a great week. And one of the reasons it was so much fun, again, is that, I mean, in many ways, it's very absurd that we have a National Tight End Day, which obviously instigated by the tight ends. You love that they are doing such a great job of marketing their position, but the tight ends did come through. And George Kittle quickly becoming my favorite player. Anytime that you have incredibly high roster allocation to someone who's having a massive year, and the guy is clearly one of the coolest dudes in the NFL, it's going to be up there. We also saw like the full Trey McBride again. Man, I don't know. So Colin hates Gardner Minshew for Brock Bowers. And you can kind of see why, because Gardner Minshew will survey the field pre-snap and figure out that the read is not actually supposed to be Brock Bowers. And then when the play starts, he will go ahead and throw to the player that the ball should go to. If you're the Las Vegas Raiders, do you want that? Or do you want your quarterback to drop back and be like, these guys where the ball should go are not good. I'm going to wait until Brock Bowers finishes all his stuff and is open. So anyway, we have that. We have obviously the Chiefs not putting a game away against a Raiders team that. So the Raiders situation was the opposite of the Ravens. It's also the opposite in that they're one of the weaker teams, where the Ravens are one of the stronger teams. But you can't simply smash Alexander Mattison into the Chiefs' elite run defense over and over when you do have someone like a Brock Bowers. Be aware of what your opponent's strengths are, right? You have to have an identity, but you also need to understand the individual game tactics. I think that's one of the things that Bill Belichick was so good at, is that they were occasionally criticized for not having that identity. But the identity was like, we're going to do what we're good at, and we're going to exploit your weaknesses. We saw some teams at both ends of the spectrum, bad teams like the Raiders, good teams like the Ravens, who didn't appear to know how to do that this week. But yeah, we got the points. We got a lot of fantastic running back scoring. We got Kyren Williams back involved in the passing game with the arrival of Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. That was a very odd one, but it was interesting that the return of those receivers actually opened things up for him. He continues to hit at a very high level, and yet is somewhat covered up by all of these other running backs who are also hitting.
Yeah, a lot of running back points. The macro positional stuff, definitely something that we want to talk about maybe in the future episodes, but yeah, I mean, it also opened up for Demarcus Robinson, apparently, who catches 2 touchdowns, and he was doing at the end of last year, scoring all these TDs. But yeah, don't go chasing Demarcus Robinson. You mentioned the tight end scored a bunch of points. Brock Bowers, basically the only tight end in the first 10 or so of ADP that didn't have a smash game. So he's a bust. Kyle Pitts scores 2 touchdowns. We get Kelsey, Kittle, Andrews, Laporta, and Kincaid all scoring a touchdown. McBride's the only top 7 tight end who doesn't, and he goes 9 for 124. And then Njoku and Ingram both scored touchdowns. There's a lot of really interesting tight end stuff to come out of this week. Obviously, Bauer's still at the very, very top of all of that. Agreed with you that they needed to get the ball to him a little bit more. Did think Jacoby Myers looked good. And I think that's actually favorable for Bowers going forward, that he's not going to have to be the only show in town necessarily. Myers wasn't really sure about his health necessarily. Comes back. Wasn't clear to me that he was going to be back last week. He gets announced on Friday or Saturday that he's going to be able to probably play. Looked good as far as a guy who's kind of seemingly playing through something. His movement was fine and looked solid. So the Raiders at least have maybe one other decent player on offense. We've talked about Myers a lot on this show over the years, Sean. He's a guy that is at least a competent wide receiver. The rest of their routes and stuff are going to, I'm not going to necessarily just crap on some young players, but they're going to guys that we wouldn't expect to be superstars. Trey Tucker and DJ Turner. And then, like you mentioned, Alexander Mattison is getting all these touches in the backfield. It's just not a good offense by any means. The Lions stuff, I don't, I alluded to it. I want to talk through it a little bit because I'm sure the listeners are like, all right, well, you said this was the most absurd thing in the world. Explain yourself. When I do the write-ups there's about an average of 11 possessions per game. And I talk about football's a game of possessions, and I, have used this number before. We're right at that number again this year. I think it's 10.8 average possessions per game per team. When I do the write-ups and a team gets really good field position, like across the 50 and has a short touchdown drive, I make note of that a little bit usually because it takes away some of the yardage, right? It takes away the ability to actually put together some stuff when you're starting way on the other side of the field, and then you get into plus script, and then you're maybe not passing as much as a result. If it happens, say, twice in a game where a team started in plus territory, I'd be like, okay, well, there's only 11 total drives, and 2 of them started at the opposing team's 40 and were only 40-yard drives, and they got points on the board, and that affected the way the whole game flowed. The Lions didn't just have 2 of those, and they didn't just start at the 40. The Lions had 5 touchdown drives that started at the plus 26 or closer. In the first half alone, when their lead gets built and they basically make it so that they're not actually going to have to play football the rest of the game, all their starters came out with 13 minutes left, Sean. Hendon Hooker came in, so they didn't even play the fourth quarter. In the first half alone, they had 4 touchdown drives from the plus 25 or closer. They went 3 and out on their first drive, then they get an interception, and they start the 23, and they score in 2 plays. Then they go 4 and out and punt on their next drive, and then they get their 1 scoring drive of the first half that was their shortest by play volume. This is the other absurd part of it. That wasn't 25 yards or shorter. It was a 70-yard touchdown drive on 1 play because the one time they traveled 70 yards, Jahmyr Gibbs decided to house it on the very first play. Then they get another short yardage or short field touchdown, which was off a long kick return. Then they get one off a long punt return. Then they get another interception 4 times in the first half alone, where they started at the 23, the 25, the 12, and then the 22. In my notes during the game I was going through it, I was like, it's happened again. That's just the first half. They score 5 touchdowns in the first half. Again, the one long drive is just a 70-yard run on 1 play. The rest of it is all 25 yards or shorter. They start the second half, and they get a punt return for a touchdown this time, which wipes away an offensive possession and is now their 6th drive or touchdown drive of the game that has been, either incredibly short yardage or basically no plays when it's been longer yardage. And then Calvin Ridley fumbles and they take over at the 26 and they have a 3-play 26-yard touchdown drive. So they had 5 drives again that were 30 yards or less, touchdown drives. I don't know how to look this up. I would probably bet a lot of money that is an NFL record. I can't imagine even having like 3 drives of 30 yards or less, touchdown drives in the same game. I mean, I guess like way back in the old days, like maybe teams just like couldn't punt and they gave up really bad field possession a lot. And yeah, there was that NFL championship a long time ago that was like 73-0. It's still the NFL record for most points in a game. Maybe they had a bunch of short touchdown drives in that 73-0 game. I have no idea. This seems like it has to have been an NFL record. And then again, their long touchdown drives or yardage were 1 play and a kick return or a punt return. I mean, so they had multiple punt returns and a kick return that went very long distance. 1 went to the house, 3 turnovers that were deep in Titans territory. And so Jared Goff, by that Ridley fumble, when they take over and they're already winning by a massive amount, I don't have the score in my notes here, but when they took over from that Ridley fumble, he was at that time 8 for 10 for 39 yards because they had been able to just run the ball in the early drives, and they had gone for essentially no yardage, but he had 3 touchdowns as well. He ends up throwing 15 passes, completing 12 for 85 yards and 3 TDs. The running backs get there, but every player on this team had no yardage in this game other than Gibbs, who has the 70-yard TD run. He winds up with 127 rushing yards, continues to look like the most dynamic running back in the NFL, which you've been saying for weeks. David Montgomery only has 38 yards from scrimmage, and then he throws a 3-yard touchdown as well. You mentioned that. Amon-Ra has 7 receiving yards. No one else on the offense other than Sam Laporta has more than 14 receiving yards. Laporta's the target dominant player in this game. He has 6 targets for 6 catches, 48 yards and a touchdown. His 48 yards meaningfully more than anyone else on the team is the point I'm trying to drive home. The second highest receiving player was 14 yards, Khalif Raymond. The box score is just absurd to look at. The possession chart is absurd to look at. They didn't gain any yards, but they're all touchdowns. They wind up the game with 225 total yards. The Titans wind up with 416. Usually when I'm writing up a game and I'm like, this team had 200 more yards than the other team and they still lost, I'm like, this is crazy that they blew this game. It's not even that weird. Like, the Lions dominated this game, but they had 200 fewer yards because the Titans kept giving them such good field position. Weirdest game, I think, of the season, and really that I can remember. It was a very bizarre game. If you have any Lions, if you have Amon-Ra or any of that stuff, I like to call it noise over at Stealing Signals. This was a very noisy football game. These things happen. They don't happen to this degree. A couple short yardage touchdown drives off turnovers happen. But then, like I said, if it happens twice, I'm like, this is weird. It happened 5 times, Sean. And then they also had the long touchdown, because the efficiency takes away the play volume and the yardage. They had the long touchdown drives as well. All of it in one game, all of the Lions scoring is these weird drives that influence. You don't get 5 short touchdowns and 2 long TDs and 7 touchdown scoring drives that are all absurd, for the ways that volume is accrued in fantasy, the play volume, the receptions and the yardage. You need some of that. You can't just have these explosive TDs over and over and over again, or the short yardage TDs over and over and over again. Or you wind up with this box score where the Lions did basically nothing other than Jahmyr Gibbs running for 127 yards.
It was a crazy game. I think early on you could see potentially what the loss of Aiden Hutchinson meant to the Lions, where it kind of gets covered up unless you were playing against maybe a Calvin Ridley that really went for 100 yards in the first quarter, which, more than he had done all season. Mason Rudolph threw for over 200 yards in the first half. And it was really a matter of the Titans taking what probably is the right path of deciding not to exploit garbage time and risk further decimating what is a terrible roster. Or we'd be talking about huge games from them, right? The Titans were able to move the ball, especially in that first half when it was kind of a football game. So that was interesting. I have called the Lions the best team in football for a while now, although when you look at the teams that they have recently beaten, probably those teams are not particularly good. They put up 42 on the Seahawks, 47 on the Cowboys. Both of those teams, again, probably not that good. They come from behind to defeat the Vikings. That was a very good game. Great win for them on the road. They blow out the Titans. Their schedule coming up includes the Packers this week, then the Texans. They have what should be a soft game against the Jags at home. Maybe, again, a soft game against the Colts. But they have the Bears, the Packers, the Bills, the Bears, the Vikings, the 49ers, and the Vikings. So I didn't say that very cleanly. But the last 6 games of the season for them, and obviously the final one won't be relevant for fantasy, but that is a dynamic stretch. I think what you're hoping is that their offense, which right now looks unstoppable, they're this unique team that can run against good run defenses. They can throw against anybody. They have so many weapons and they have so much creativity that they're probably going to score. And you would hope that that pulls along a team like the Texans, which has been very bland and disappointing, that it pulls along a team like the Chicago Bears, where they have the 2 late games against. Ideally, we'll see a very different version of Caleb Williams in those games than we got this past week. You hope that the Packers game is a shootout. You hope that the Bills game is a shootout. That's a game at home in the Dome where we could talk about the teams being in the 50s, right? You hope that at that point, that game against the 49ers is the Lions sort of clinching home field advantage in the NFC, but with the 49ers having it be maybe the most important game of their season. And then, if they haven't clinched, you hope that that final game at home against the Vikings is for the NFC North title, the overall NFC title, and that you get a shootout, you get Sam Darnold and Justin Jefferson being able to keep up. And in so many of these games, that's kind of the theme, is that you hope they pull the other team along, the opponent keeps up. One of the things that we got this most recent week again is all the way back on Thursday night, but the Vikings come out, they look really good, as they often have. Justin Jefferson plays an extraordinary game, and yet even that is not enough to carry Sam Darnold and the offense, and they eventually bog down and are defeated. You're going to get games like this. I mean, obviously the Rams beat the Vikings. You have the Browns with the big upset over the Ravens. Some of the teams that don't have great records are actually not that bad, which is one of the fun things about the NFL. Now, probably everybody in the NFC South or AFC South, I mean, those teams are truly as bad as their records would indicate. But yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see what the Vikings are able to do, if they're able to hold up, if the Bears are able to hold up, whether or not the Packers can keep Jordan Love healthy. The NFC North is certainly evolving into, if it hasn't just very clearly been all season, the most fun division in football. From that perspective, you sort of wish that the Bears had won just to kind of keep up. From every other perspective, you're like, this was a Hail Mary that was virtually guaranteed to be completed, because a team does not play like the Chicago Bears and win that game. You can't get dominated in every facet and play like that on offense and win. It's just simply not the way football works. And I don't mean from a mechanical perspective. I mean from an aesthetic and ethical perspective. Is just simply not the way things go.
I had it written up that way as well, that the Bears nearly stole this game, and then the Commanders, stole it back. But it wasn't that the Commanders stole the game from the Bears in any kind of a way. And the guy, I'm surprised to hear you say that Jared Goff is your MVP, because the guy that I would cape up for pretty heavily right now and have been is Jayden Daniels. I think he's clearly the MVP. This Washington team should not be good. They are good. They're good because of him. Like the Jared Goff stuff, I think he's good, but I think the running game would be good if there was a different quarterback there. They have a really great offensive line. And I know the Commanders have good offensive line too, but like David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, those guys are players, and you could put not any quarterback back there, but they'd still be able to run the ball. I feel like Jayden Daniels makes the running game work for the Commanders, in addition to how good he's been as a passer and as a scrambler, and he's made this team relevant. They were really good in this game, drove all the way down. The problem is they kicked 3 field goals shorter than an extra point in the first half. They weren't able to actually get the ball punched into the end zone. Teams are going to have those types of games, particularly when their play calling is trying to protect their quarterback, who you want to be able to use in these short spaces, his mobility, but he has rib injuries. One of the drives, they get a penalty that puts it a little further back. One of the drives, Zach Ertz has a ball in his hands, but it pops out when he comes down to the ground. That's 2 of the 3 drives right there where,
that one was interesting to me. Because we sort of have fun with these conversations from time to time. That play versus the Ladd McConkey play, both touchdowns, neither touchdowns. Don't know what I'm talking about.
I thought they were called correctly, both of them.
Okay.
You don't like Ladd McConkey very much. So
I thought you had to hold the ball in the end zone if you're fighting for it. Like, you can't just be like, okay, well, we had simultaneous possession for a while and then the ball went. There was one where the receiver, and maybe you remember this specific play, initially kind of ruled by the closest official incomplete, where the player had been lying on the ground with the ball for a while before the defender ripped it out. That one, a clear touchdown, and was eventually called a touchdown.
Well, that happened on a Hail Mary, the Rodgers Hail Mary to Alan Lazard earlier this year, I believe, where he caught the ball and then the ball got ripped out after he landed. Maybe that was called the TD initially. I do remember what you're talking about.
What happened once this week?
Play.
But I didn't.
Oh,
it may have happened when I was on the treadmill. I don't have it in my notes.
I don't remember seeing it this week, but yeah, we do see that from time to time where the player is clearly down and then the defender rips it out, and they're usually pretty good about nailing those. The Ertz one you're saying probably should have counted if we're counting all these other ones, and I think that's a fair point. I think, like I said, I think it was probably correctly called, but I think it was very close, and you could have made a pretty strong case that that should have counted as a TD. That was sort of my point in bringing it up, and then also bringing up when you get an offensive penalty and you get moved back to an and goal situation where you're at the 15, it gets tough to score TD. They wind up kicking field goals on those drives, not scoring on their other drive. outgained the Bears 481 to 307 in this game. Meaningfully better,
which would still be a lot even without the Hail Mary.
Right, even without the Hail Mary would be quite a bit. The Hail Mary was about a 50-yarder. Daniels threw a really nice deep ball to Terry McLaurin at one point that got him down in close. McLaurin has 176 air yards in this game and looks like, a 22 ADOT on 8 targets, like a ton of deep work overall. I don't know how the air yards work on the Hail Mary because Noah Brown winds up with 124 on his 6 targets. I assume it just got registered to him because he's the guy who ends up catching that play. I doubt it would have went on to McLaurin for any reason. But yeah, McLaurin continuing to look like he's in the best situation he's been in really in his career because he has this dynamic deep ball thrower. That throw to McLaurin was another. I mean, every time Daniels throws the ball downfield, it's just fun to watch. I mean, so many of them have been these perfect deep throws. And part of the issue we have with these explosive passes is sometimes they're there and the quarterbacks are not making the throws. Like one of the things we could talk a little bit about Anthony Richardson. I don't know if we want to get into it a ton, Sean. I tweeted about it a little bit on Twitter. I was a little bit out of line, calling some people dumb for criticizing it. I do think taking himself out of the game was overblown a little bit. And I think Steichen seized on an opportunity to basically give up a reason to bench him because I think he just wanted to bench him. If you want to talk about his play has not been
good. Was that mentioned at all by the coaching staff? I had mentioned it just to, family members in discussion that because of that one play, which is utterly meaningless and yet from a PR perspective is catastrophic for Richardson, that it gives the coaching staff cover in a kind of a separate way, that the macho element as opposed to the play quality element to do the benching, which in many ways is just kind of unfortunate for him. You probably can't do what he did at the same time. I mean, receivers and running backs have to do it constantly. And
it was 3rd and goal from the 23. This whole idea of like he had to stay in. The point I made on Twitter was because a lot of people were like, that never happens. And that was a point that I believe Pat McAfee made on his show and some things. And it doesn't happen. We don't see it. I understand that. Part of the reason we don't see it, Sean, is the quarterbacks go back to the huddle. And a lot of times, and I know you've seen this when you watch the games, I had some people tell me they couldn't remember this. This doesn't happen. It happens. I'm not going to debate whether it happens. They're slow to come out of the huddle. They're slow to the line. They wind up using a timeout because they're tired. We've seen it with like Tom Brady before after he has to go for a run. Like maybe I'm misremembering Tom Brady. Maybe there isn't a specific example of Tom Brady doing this, but it's pocket passers I've even seen it with, let alone the guys that are actually scrambling around a ton. Because a lot of people are like, Lamar Jackson would never do that. Okay, fine. Like, I mean, I'll grant that. Although Lamar apparently went to the locker room that one time. People widely believe because he pooped his pants. We'll put that aside. But that's
an appropriate reason to go to the locker room.
That's the belief on why he went to the locker room. I believe in a playoff game.
I would
came
also
right back
go to the
out
locker room in that situation.
I would probably as well. But this idea that you can't come out of a game and that quarterbacks don't do it, I understand. My point was that I do believe that quarterbacks get tired and they wind up just burning a timeout in those situations. But it was early 3rd quarter. They were down by 10 and they needed those timeouts in the second half. And they were going to kick a field goal regardless. It's 3rd and goal from the 23. I actually thought it was good situational awareness to be like, yo, I'm really exhausted. And I don't think taking a sack here or me forcing a throw because I don't want to, like, he might wind up throwing a pick. He threw a really bad pick right before half. Anyway, I don't want to turn this whole conversation into the Anthony Richardson subbing out thing. I agree with you that it was bad optics. My eyebrows went up. I want to be clear. When I saw it, I was like, whoa, that's bizarre. And yet, you think about the situation a little bit and you're like, that play didn't matter. And burning the timeout would have been catastrophically big mistake. You need those 3
And we
timeouts.
saw teams burn timeouts, especially when they were sort of leading, but they hadn't blown the game out or anything, call timeouts simply because they wanted to get a little bit better play. The team hadn't gotten up to the line fast enough. I mean, Aaron Rodgers can't get any plays off at this point in his career. It's worse to be in a situation where you're using all 6 of your timeouts to simply get plays in, which we actually did see a couple times from teams this week, than having someone say, look, I'm go out for a second. You've got Joe Flacco, who was going to be the starter the next week anyway, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, well, he could have stayed in and done a handoff. Well, he subbed out immediately after he got tackled. He didn't know the play call. And additionally, they may have just called the handoff because they brought in their backup quarterback. They may not have actually called a handoff if Richardson was in there. They may have tried to throw the ball to the end zone. Who knows? Anyway, the point I wanted to make is I do believe his play warrants a benching. I just think it's really weird that he's getting so much criticism over something that was a meaningless play. If you sub out on like a 1st and goal in a key spot, I'm going to be like, what are you doing? You can't do that. Subbing out on 3rd and goal from the 23 after your team has 2 offensive penalties, one of which negated a passing TD, right? Like he actually had made a nice play and thrown a touchdown, and then there was an offensive pass interference penalty on that one. It negated his TD. He's tried to get the ball in the end zone on this drive at a certain, it's not like he's just giving up either, but at a certain point when it's 3rd and goal from the 23, you realize that the drive is a field goal drive. That's what happens in the NFL. You can't force
also tactically, you can always sub out if your backup is superior.
Yeah, there you go.
Selfless move for the team.
That's the bigger point. He did miss some throws in this game. He also had some teammates drop some balls, but he will be benched. I think that's a huge storyline going forward. But yeah, no, I mean, like his play was like did warrant the benching, which is like the, this conflating factor that is overarching this whole discussion. There's some talk that players in the locker room thought it was, weak of him, and then Steichen seizes on it and he comments, "You can't take yourself out of the game." And I'm like, man, a head coach can pretty easily cover in that situation for his quarterback. I just think he didn't want to cover for his quarterback. And then and I wrote that on Monday, that I think this is like he's losing the locker room. And then on Tuesday, they announced that they've benched him, right? And so it was
during
interesting.
The game itself, the commentators were referencing just how poorly Richardson was playing and said last week when Richardson did this, Steichen blamed it on himself and probably will again. And I was like, I don't know that he's going to again. You do it up until the point where you have to make a change.
Yep. That's exactly right. Anyway, that whole discussion is not, I keep saying we shouldn't have that discussion, and I keep talking about it. Joe Flacco is in now. I think that's a positive for Michael Pittman. I think it's a bigger positive for Josh Downs, who looked like an absolute superstar in this game. Made a great catch and run on a play where he's open and Richardson actually hit him. Made an incredible leaping catch down to the 1. He's played incredibly well this year, Sean. I compared him this week to like a young Tyler Lockett, not necessarily stylistically, because I don't know that I've ever seen Lockett lay out the way that Downs did in this game. But it's this undersized player that you don't think should be as good down the field, but he's just always making the plays. And every facet, he's great with the ball in his hands. He's an efficient player. Now you get a drop back passer who's going to get more volume out there. I think Downs could be key. The other huge impact here is Jonathan Taylor, who has not played with Flacco yet this year. He was out both of the games that Flacco played earlier. Or maybe they played some snaps together. I'm not entirely sure. Well, certainly they played one snap together this past week where Flacco handed off to him on 3rd goal for the 23. But I noted in Signals a couple of weeks ago that it was a little bit bad luck for Taylor's fantasy value that he went out the week that Flacco came in to start, and that there was this potential for the dramatic increase in high value touches, as I like to call them, as we talk about the reception game, right? Like Flacco's a drop back passer. He's going to dump off to his backs. Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson in that first game did combine for a number of catches. They didn't quite as many in that second game that Flacco started. Flacco wasn't quite as good in that game. I think the second one was at Tennessee. Taylor, those backs didn't look very good. Taylor came back this week and looked very good. Dominated the snaps. I think he was at 80+% snaps. He's going to play all the downs, so it's not going to be split like it was split a little bit between Sermon and Goodson, particularly the passing downs. And Flacco's a kind of quarterback that can throw to his running backs 8 times in a game, right? Like he's going to drop back, he's going to read it out downfield, but he's going to find his check down. He's not going to scramble or any of those things. Jonathan Taylor, who looked really good running the ball in this game, now suddenly is going to have a massively different on the scale receiving value than, again, he hasn't played with Flacco yet, than he's had in all the games that he's played so far, because they've all been with Richardson. He's a guy to go out and consider buying right now if Flacco is going to be the quarterback for the future.
It's really interesting with him and how those receptions will manifest if they do. One of the reasons that Flacco is, more or less fantasy nirvana is that you get both the consistent vertical shots, which forces the defense to play a little more honest it creates the upside for players like Mitchell and Pence. And I don't know, Michael Pittman is still a tricky receiver in terms of finding the quarterback who's right for him. There are a lot of, if you had Gardner Minshew, I think Michael Pittman would be a top, 6 or 7 wide receiver. You do hope that it can be a Josh Downs. And like you mentioned, the almost touchdown catch was one of the greatest receptions you'll ever see. So often, I think when you have a smaller receiver who is able to get open instantly off the line, the team feels that the value of that player's ability to get open is so immense that the player then ends up getting a lot of short area targets because you can create successful plays that way. You can get completions for your quarterback. And because you have so many of those targets, it makes the receiver look like an underneath receiver, perhaps exclusively. And Downs has had a little bit of that. Certainly at times, Zay Flowers has had a little bit of that. And for both of these guys going back to college, right? We are seeing with both of them this season that they are not remotely limited to that. And it makes them potential massive stars as they continue to, move through their NFL careers. I'm excited to watch what they do. Maybe it's simply because I have a decent amount of Zay Flowers and certainly none of the other Ravens receivers, but I am somewhat optimistic that Deontay Johnson can have a similar effect to what we think DeAndre Hopkins is going to have for Xavier Worthy, where if anything, maybe it helps him very slightly. Maybe the target volume drops a tad, but the efficiency can go up. As we think about Taylor, it is, I think, fascinating to think about how strength of schedule might play into it. One of the things that I have noted a bit as it relates to Barkley and Taylor, who I see as fairly similar players, with Taylor being the better player. And I know certainly with how hot Saquon Barkley has been, a lot of people are going to, I think, justifiably dispute that. I'm not saying people who are disputing that are necessarily wrong. I disagree with them, but they're certainly not necessarily wrong. Right now, we have a point where the gap in scoring between Barkley, who's at 20.6, and Taylor, who is at 18.3, certainly not a gap that, as we go along, couldn't close and move solidly for Taylor.
Closer than I would have guessed based on the fact that Barkley's had some monster games.
Yeah, it's almost impossible not to anchor to things that happen early and things that happen on national television. One of the reasons that that gap would exist is that in the first 2 weeks, Taylor was at 11 and then at 15. The last 3 weeks, 3 very good games. So he's been pulling his average up, whereas obviously Barkley has had a couple of misses more recently. One of the problems that I potentially see is that Indianapolis has a bottom 5 schedule going forward for the running backs. The Eagles have a top 2. And especially when you watched what happened when the Eagles played the Giants, you're like, if we can avoid like a 40-point game from Saquon Barkley as, managers who are playing against him, then you probably dodged a little bit of a bullet because, there are these gaping holes up the middle. Someone with Barkley's profile, which is incredible jets in a straight line, that's not what you want to see if you're hoping he doesn't, put up a huge score. We're going to have more of those. I guess in some ways and I've written about that in the Zero RB universe, about how even if you're a Barkley skeptic, you probably want to look at buying in any situation where anyone's trying to sell, which those situations basically don't exist, again, because of the narratives surrounding things right now. But we continue to see some of the concerns with Barkley that we articulated during the offseason, which is that the receiving upside was going to be essentially zero, and you could lose goal line touches. The Cincinnati Bengals are an amazing matchup for running backs. Barkley obviously looked very good again, and yet the Eagles did everything you could possibly do from a fantasy perspective to neutralize a superstar and push all of that value onto Jalen Hurts. Now, we don't know that that's going to continue. I would assume that you're going to try and keep both guys happy, and that you're going to have some games where Barkley also just, has, I think we have 2 or 3 touchdown performances from Barkley coming, at least once or twice down the stretch.
A specific note on that. I love where you're going. In that Giants game, you might not have seen this because it made the rounds on social. He was mic'd up, and there was a clip where Sirianni came and talked to him on the sideline and said, "Hey, you're 12 yards away from your career high in rushing yards. Do you want to go out and get that?" I kind of wanted to pull. The game was done. I kind of wanted to pull you out of the game here, and he was like, "No, it's fine." Like it was very, very team first, and that's why the clip circled. He was like, "Let the young guys play." Like he was really adamant. And Sirianni's like, "Are you sure? Because I want you to get it if it means something to you." He's like, "Absolutely not. I'm good. I've had my share of production so far today, basically." In so many words, I can't remember exactly how he framed it, but the tush push stuff. I also saw a clip where he, on the 3rd rushing TD for Hurts, I think he was mic'd up on this one, if I'm remembering it right, but I know that there was a tush push where he was mic'd up, and he's calling for them to call the tush push again because they got stuffed. And then he pushes him, and then he's like celebrating like crazy. Maybe the thing that happened on the 3rd one was Hurts gave him the ball to spike, and maybe the other mic'd up thing I'm talking about was the other tush push in the Giants game, because that was probably just all from the same game where he was mic'd up. But he was very pumped about Hurts scoring on the tush. He was saying, "Run it again, run it again. We got stuffed, run it again." And then he gets right up behind him and he pushes him, and he's celebrating like he just scored the touchdown. Point is, just inside the locker room, I got the impression inside the locker room that Saquon's not like, "I need to get my TDs." He's very team first right now. He's loving that he's on a team that's winning. I don't think he's actually caring about the fact that he's not scoring a lot of touchdowns. And which isn't true for every player. And hats off to him for that as a human. Yeah.
I would like to think that kind of behavior is going to encourage them to get him one of these epic games that people talk about for decades as a result. And this Eagles squad still has lots of flaws, but they also have the potential to do something like that, certainly in a one-off for sure. And again, that's going to kill us in fantasy if it happens, but it would be really cool otherwise. Thinking through again what that team has, all weekend I was sort of thinking of the Adam Troutman touchdown as the best catch of the weekend because it was a crazy catch. Right? If JSN had done that with his one-handed attempt a couple weeks ago, then we would have been fine with it. One of the things that did happen in the Broncos game is that suddenly the Broncos guys caught the ball, and you're like, "Oh, well, if you catch the ball, then Bo Nix looks a lot better." But thinking of that Josh Downs reception, and then, Ben, the best catch of the week was Devontae Smith. Smith is a superstar, right? I'm going to keep going back to that. So, and both guys, they have Brown, they have Smith, they have Saquon Barkley, and sometimes because you're covering those other 3 guys, they have Dallas Goedert running around with no one within 30 yards of him, which is a pretty efficient way to play football. So, we have these 2 players who I think are similar on very opposite ends of the spectrum schedule-wise. We do have Taylor now in a situation where his receiving upside is no longer capped in the same way. That could be very positive. It was also cool to watch him run in this game because you get that combination of, one of the things that's kind of interesting about Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, and Saquon Barkley is that all 3 of those guys actually run like very small backs, and it's for the good and the bad, right? Saquon Barkley doesn't actually do a lot in terms of certainly breaking tackles, but you get him in space and he's gone. Derrick Henry, a very similar type of thing. Now, he actually does do some of these things where you get him downhill and then, some secondary player tries to come up on him and he's like, "I'm going to break those tackles."
The stiff arm's coming.
Right. So he ends up with good numbers in that category. He ends up with good yards after contact numbers. But we also see that it's not even like tentativeness, but just the patience around the line. If you get on Derrick Henry's legs around the line of scrimmage, you're going to get him down. If you don't, then he's so big and so fast that it's big, big, big trouble. Jonathan Taylor, another back where that patience, vision, cutting ability around the line of scrimmage, I think is understated and undervalued because some of his peripherals don't always look as good as other backs who are similarly sized. And yet in this game, just as an example of things that I think he does more often than people realize, he is credited with 0 broken tackles. And he's credited with half of his yards coming before contact. And so it's very tempting to say, well, that's on the offensive line. But then he had 5 forced missed tackles, which means that if you're not letting the guy get contact, you're beating those players before they can get a hand on you. And then you have Jonathan Taylor's speed. That's where you get the really big time yards before contact numbers of the superstars who have that in their portfolio. I mean, Jonathan Taylor delivers that in a way that backs his size generally don't. You're talking more about a Devon Achane or a Jahmyr Gibbs. The reason that Jonathan Taylor is off to the races for 50, 60, and 70-yard touchdowns is that he tries to make guys miss as opposed to hitting them at the line of scrimmage. So instead of getting a nice 4-yard run, you get the big runs. Some of those big runs are coming, I think, even against what at least looks like to our strength of schedule tool, a not very favorable slate of upcoming matchups.
I love the matchup notes whenever you bring those out because I'm not always looking ahead enough at that type of stuff. Another spot where that got brought up to me this week was the Browns, because I was very optimistic about how they look going forward from a passing perspective. Their pass rate over expected was plus 5.3%, which is meaningful toward the pass. Their highest since week 3, their second highest, or excuse me, it was the second highest on the week. Jameis Winston, going to chuck it around a little bit. I think one of the keynotes, I got a lot of people being like, oh, should I go add Jameis Winston, all these things. One of the keynotes that should be mentioned is in this final game-winning drive that he has, where we see the highlight of him throwing to Cedric Tillman for the touchdown. He also hits Kyle Hamilton, who is a safety on the Ravens, right in the hands. And Hamilton juggles a ball, drops it, and does the lay on his face on the turf thing where he's like, if I catch that, the game's over and we win. And I'm sure he felt even worse after the game because the Browns did end up then finishing the game, the drive with the TD. He had an opportunity on that interception that he missed. Winston not having that last touchdown still wouldn't have killed his score, for the record. He had a 330-yard, 3-touchdown game. It would have been about a 280-yard, 2-touchdown game if he throws a pick there. Still a decent fantasy day for what we're seeing from a lot of the quarterbacks around the league. But the Browns have a really hard quarterback schedule going forward. I've written favorably about Cedric Tillman, Sean. I think he just looks really good. He's a big, physical wide receiver. He was not very good in the numbers last year. There were some issues as a prospect. We talked about him last week because he looked really good last week, and I asked you your thoughts about him last week. Looked really good again here. Again, who knows what the long-term ceiling is? Maybe he's just one of those players that is capitalizing on good matchups, which would be meaningful because the matchups do turn really bad soon. 2 games against the Steelers coming up, Kansas City, several tough matchups coming up for them. But as far as what we've seen in these 2 games, I'm seeing a player that has size and is getting open at different depths and is making plays on the back end, actually catching the ball. He feels a lot to me like the Nico Collins emergence over the last couple of years, where Collins is good, but you're like, does he have enough smoothness at his size and those things? Is he that type of player? How high is his ceiling really? And every time that's been questioned for Nico over the last few years, it's just gotten higher and higher and higher. He's so good. I wrote that it would be like a diet Nico Collins breakout because I don't think Cedric Tillman's going to be the next Nico Collins. That's not likely. There's a lot more guys that look like this in 2 games and don't go on to become Nico Collins than there are that actually become Nico Collins. But Tillman has looked that way for 2 games, 21 targets, tons of production. But the schedule looks awful coming forward is the key point. Now, he may be able to overcome it. I talked about this a little bit because Judy may draw some of that attention, right? Just 2 weeks ago, Tillman wasn't even playing. So he's kind of in a unique spot where like he may not get the number 1 cornerback coverage in all the cases. He may because he's more of that prototypical X receiver. We'll see how that plays out for him. The main reason I'm talking about this Browns schedule, number 1, is about Jameis Winston, how meaningful of an impact he can have, and getting your thoughts on that. Number 2 is about David Njoku, who looked really, really good in this game, made plays down the field, sweet catch on a 50-50 ball with the defender's back turn, the kind of play that Jameis Winston offers that Deshaun Watson doesn't. He just stays in the pocket, scrambles around, and eventually takes a sack. Winston will see the defender's back turned and throw that ball up and say, go make a play. It's a little underthrown. David Njoku has the ball skills to make those plays. We saw that from him a couple of times in this game, that the catch point skills that he does offer, which add to what we've talked about with the role change, where he does the block and release short yardage reception stuff. These matchups that look really difficult for the quarterback and the receiver coming forward, actually, if you go into the RotoViz fantasy streaming app, they look favorable for the tight end. It's a top 6, I think, tight end schedule. These are defenses that do really well with the quarterback position at taking with the receiver, and thus almost funnel targets toward the tight end position. And this is a team where their best receiving weapon may just be their tight end, David Njoku, and he does it down the field, and he does it at the line of scrimmage. Shawn, I wrote that I think I would have him around the tight end 4 range. The only guys I feel confident I'd have ahead of him are Brock Bowers, George Kittle, and Trey McBride. And I mean, McBride, you can even be like, is he ever going to score a touchdown? We joked about it before the show. Neither of us thinks he is, because it's just not a great situation for him, but he gets so much volume and he's so good. I do think you need to have McBride at basically at tight end 3-ish. There are some other really good tight ends that would be in that mix. Kyle Pitts has been playing really well. Travis Kelce has been playing well. Dalton Kincaid is our guy, Shawn. I just feel a little concerned about the overall volume there with Keon Coleman coming along and Amari Cooper in town. Now, the Kincaid thesis was he could be their number 1, and all of a sudden it looks crowded, right? Like, I mean, Khalil Shakir gets all these short area targets. But getting back to the Browns, the schedule stuff looks very favorable for Njoku over the rest of the season. I think he could have a top 5 tight end production, the rest of the way. Maybe it's top 3 is sort of the point that I'm getting at. Think he's a clear guy to go target right now.
They looked fun. It was just so clear to everyone that the Browns would benefit from going in a different direction. It was a little bit strange in some ways that they were so reluctant. You get the impression that Winston has not looked good in practice, because I just don't think there's any way you end up as the emergency quarterback and then have the team be like, well, that was game plan specific.
And then they announced,
there's no way that makes any sense.
And 2 notes on this. They announced this week that he's a starter, and a bunch of people on Twitter were like, oh, they're stating the obvious, but that seems meaningful that they felt that, to your point. And then the other important point on this is Winston hasn't been very good in limited time the last 2 years. He started 2021 really well. That's the year I believe he tore his ACLs, 5-2 with the Saints. Didn't really play much in 2020 either. His last real meaningful time, other than those 7 games in 2021, come all the way back in 2019. And that's the 30-30 year. That's his last year in Tampa. So I think people maybe don't, that's the other note I just want to throw in here. Maybe don't remember that Winston hasn't played a lot of football over the last 5 or so years. We don't necessarily know how good he's going to be. In the last 2 years, I mentioned small sample. He did throw over 150 passes, 6 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. So yeah, I mean, a little bit of, I was telling people this last week, they're going to throw more, but I think people remember that 2019 season in Tampa. I'm like, that's 2019. That's 5 seasons ago. He was a 25-year-old. He's 30 now. And to your point, I think you make a great point that he maybe looks bad in practice, because he hasn't been great the last times we've seen him actually on fields recently. So,
well, and when he was the sort of nominal starter for the Saints for a short stretch and then got hurt and then gets healthy, they did not reinsert him and felt that Andy Dalton gave them a better chance, which, again, Andy Dalton is a similar type of player to where if he were the quarterback for the Cleveland Browns, he'd be also much more excited than having Deshaun Watson as the QB. But it gives you a little bit of a context for where he's likely to be. But I do think that one of the things about the situation with Deshaun Watson is that this is probably not a bad team and not a bad offense. And he was just so extraordinarily bad that he was destroying everything. And, perhaps it does help to get Nick Chubb back. And Nick Chubb's numbers were interesting. This is, again, I think, a fun example of the way understanding sort of different numbers and working through exactly what happened is sort of interesting. SIS, which again is going to have different numbers than some other sources, charted him with 0 broken tackles and 0 forced missed tackles. But the funny thing about that is that, like, if you just simply pick up 3 guys and carry them with you for 5 yards, you don't necessarily accomplish either of those 2 charted things, but like your tackler's carried numbers would be very good. This is a game where Nick Chubb rushed for 52 yards. He had 60 yards after contact.
Wow.
So, again,
And I mean, tough matchup. Yeah.
Exactly. And you talk about schedule. He actually has one of the better upcoming slates as well. And so you could see kind of a split where we get Njoku, Chubb performing well, Tillman, Judy barely relevant, but those guys maybe a little bit limited. Winston, interesting, but probably not a league winner. That would be the direction that I see it going. But it's fun that you can watch the Cleveland Browns play a football game now. And that part, it was just absolutely night and day.
Yeah, that was a really, really fun game from this weekend in terms of the fantasy implications. There was just guys able to do their things. Elijah Moore comes alive. 12 targets, 8 catches, 85 yards, right? Judy has 5 for 79. Nice catch and run. Tillman 7 for 99 and 2, and Njoku 5 for 61 and 1. I also had the favorable notes on, or not the same notes as you, but had some favorable notes on Chubb saying he looked good, and we didn't get much production, but this is a tough run defense. 16 carries he gets in this game, in his second game back. He's obviously not super compromised is the one, that's the concern you have, which, by the way, Shawn, as far as some of the things that we can talk about as being a little bit negative, I've more or less given up on Javonte Williams. I'm kind of curious your thoughts there, but Bo Nix looked good. We should talk about the Broncos a little bit. Bo Nix looked good. Fun to watch him excel in a game where he actually had some time. We talked on the show last week. I kind of felt like maybe some of the short arm throws and things that we saw on Thursday night the week prior were not having his platform under him. They actually mentioned it on the broadcast, where I'm not sure if we talked about that on the show or off the show about Nix, but I had this take that, he's sort of doing it all with his arm, and maybe the game's a little bit too sped up for him. I feel like you talked about that on the show because you talked through the ways that he could develop, and it was a good conversation. I'm pretty sure we recorded that, but I can't be certain. This game, the broadcast actually mentioned there's been a lot of talk about his legs. So apparently that's been a story somewhere, maybe in the Denver area. The Panthers don't get a lot of pressure. Nix is able to get his feet under him, and he's driving throws down the field. It was his highest passing ADOT of the year, his most total air yards of the year. He threw some incredible balls early in the game. He had some misses late. I had made a note early that was like, check out his pass rate over expected, because that number for him, his expected completion percentage, is always going to be high because it's the low ADOT stuff. But this game was going to have a higher higher difficulty of throw on average, lower expected completion percentage. And so I made a little note for myself and I went and checked it out. He was plus 7 percentage points in pass rate over expected. I think that was probably higher in the first half, and that he maybe was a little bit negative in the second half, because I felt like early on he was hitting on some throws that were like, he's completing everything. I think he only had like 2 incompletions in the first, whatever it was. He was like 20 for 22 or something at one point. Started missing some throws a little bit later in terms of just them going incomplete. Not necessarily like he looked bad, but I felt like he looked so much better in this game than the week prior. He got his feet under him, had the time against a bad defense, in fairness, but we haven't seen him play against bad defenses. He's been playing a lot of tough defenses or in tough conditions, and looked like a very competent NFL quarterback in this game.
And obviously we have to look at our own biases, and by we, I mean myself. And one of the things that when I wrote this up for the Monday piece, I tried to really emphasize that some of the things that show up in the SIS numbers are kind of hard to square, because, SIS has him being really, really good. They actually had him really looking good through the first 7 weeks, which a lot of the, probably not really accurate. And it's certainly a gross way to convey it to say the non-advanced stats. But certainly his raw numbers didn't look fantastic. SIS had him graded much higher than that. One of the things that I was noting is that perhaps in part that's because there is an element for their points above average number that looks at the receivers. And certainly the receiving core for the Broncos has been fairly weak. Now, again, you're talking a little bit chicken or the egg, and I think a lot of people would put that on Nix. SIS doesn't necessarily, which, when we're talking about human beings charting things, even when we're talking about things like the algorithms, when you're looking at how they chart things, in football especially, that stuff is not going to be completely clear. SIS really liked him. The target depth was greater than I think people realize. And the combination of mobility and sack mitigation was extremely high. And so that is something that just, again, it's part of his profile that if you think he's a terrible passer, you're like, that's not enough. If you think he's a competent passer, then that makes a huge difference. That was one of the things that was given to Anthony Richardson for reasons why his inability to complete passes wasn't going to be as big of a problem because he avoids sacks. That part has been true. But at a certain point, you do have to complete some passes. SIS has Knicks now up to number 7 in points above average per play. I would suggest that probably still, or probably maybe even pretty dramatically overstates what he has been to this point. But I think it would be difficult to look at the game against the Panthers and think that he's not an absolute star. And so you back off of that, and it's still, I think, got to be very positive for the Broncos. Also for fantasy managers, this was a game where he scored a lot of points. I mean, he's doing absolutely fine for fantasy. If you had just started him all year long, you would be fine, which seems like kind of a weird thing to say given a couple of his early performances. There's also a dynamic here where he does run into a few difficult games going forward. But again, if we're thinking from a fantasy perspective, it's absolutely massive because every game is so inflated in value in football because there are so few. Their second game against the Chiefs is in week 18. To miss that game with what the Chiefs are currently doing to teams is big. Maybe if it's even just in best ball, because probably most people are still not going to feel comfortable starting him in a single QB managed league, but it's a big deal, right? He gets to miss that game. That's very helpful. You look at this though, and I do kind of want to remind myself, and certainly anybody who's as high on him as I am, that Caleb Williams, when he got to play the Carolina Panthers and the Jacksonville Jaguars, you're thinking, okay, he's coming out of this. He's going to be a superstar. And then you watch him play against the Washington Commanders. And one of the things that's been sort of interesting there, we have the game the previous week. You were kind of joking about it on the show that people were, giving you a hard time saying, oh, it's not all Jaden Daniels because they were able to beat the Panthers really easily. And partly it's the Panthers are terrible. Partly it's that their defense is rising up some. That was something that showed up in Blair's wrong read numbers this last week. So I think the matchup of Caleb Williams against the Commanders was probably not very favorable for him. And yet at the same time, I'd be hard pressed to say that he looked any better than Anthony Richardson. Now, he didn't have as many passes where a guy is wide open and he misses them by 5 yards. Right. The thing for anybody who is simply looking at the numbers with Anthony Richardson is not able to watch the games or not interested in watching all the games or what have you, is that Anthony Richardson's guys are uncovered essentially. Yeah. And he's throwing the ball in a completely different area. It's not just going 10 for 32. It's that a lot of those misses are just impossible misses.
Did you feel like that was so? One of the weird thoughts I had about him this week was that in the first half, especially, his ball placement was actually a lot better, and he had several plays just like the timing wasn't necessarily there, and there were some incompletions. It's not really relevant because in the second half, he still had some really bad. It's ball placement with Richardson. We talked about it all year, and I've been criticized on social for being too hard on him, and so I'm trying to be fair. But I've been really hard on the ball placement, and I agree with you. When you watch the games, it's just terrible. I thought he was a little better in this game. That's not even a relevant point. Caleb Williams, 10 for 24 in this game, and you were just making the point. It doesn't feel the same way. My note on him felt like Shane Waldron again. We talked about it in the first few weeks of the year, how it feels like he's just standing back there, and even when he has time, he can't find somewhere to throw it. And that wasn't something that was a prospect issue with him or anything. And then when I see some of the all-22 stuff, I don't really usually break down the all-22 myself a ton or make notes on, I want to go back to this play where he's staring downfield. And I wish I knew where some of these plays were. I would go back and watch them, but I don't do that personally. But I have seen some people show some of the plays and say, look at these route combinations. They're like a child drew them up. They're horrible. They're not spaced. They're not giving you different layers or different options. There's no clear progression. It's just not a good football play. And that's an NFL offensive coordinator being, designing NFL plays or designing football plays in general is a little bit complex. Like, I mean, it is possible that a guy could be an NFL offensive coordinator and also just not be very good at it. And it kind of have been hidden at some point. But we know that Waldron wasn't very good in Seattle. We know the stuff that JSN said over the offseason. And we've talked about it with Caleb early in the year that he's standing back there and it looks like he should have somebody open and there isn't. I do agree with you. The Commanders defense has looked better recently. And maybe they were just playing really good defense down the field, etc. But for Caleb, for me in this game, he's back there. He has time and he has nowhere to go with the ball. And I don't think it's got to be out on his weapons. Maybe Rome Odunze is not great. Maybe Keenan Allen's getting a little older. You got DJ Moore out there. You got Cole Kmet out there. I just don't buy that those 4 weapons are not good enough for somebody to be getting open if the play call is solid. It's not the passing, to your point, but 10 completions, bad.
But don't you think he's got to be able to make plays?
I think he has it.
For me now, it's almost like, yes, the coordinator is a catastrophe. And I do think, again, like we were saying early in the season, that if I am the owner of the Chicago Bears, I fire the coaching staff after that game and say, I understand that we're even actually on kind of a playoff trajectory. We're not going to make it because of those other 3 teams in our division. And this can't go on any longer. I mean, you're going to have Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze, your 2 top 10 picks, are going to be busts by the end of their rookie years. And you think about that and you say, well, Odunze is simply too good. I mean, how many top 10 picks at wide receiver, especially when they had some of the age trajectory red flags, have been busts in the last couple decades? I mean, the Patriots would tell you, I mean, and most of their picks are a little bit later, but that it's actually impossible to draft wide receivers. Yeah. Certainly your receiver can bust. Caleb Williams, it seems impossible. And yet, I mean, you think about where people were with Anthony Richardson after he scored those rushing touchdowns to start his rookie year. You think about what the Carolina Panthers paid to get Bryce Young instead of CJ Stroud. You think about the players who were taken ahead of Patrick Mahomes. I mean, I think we're already in a very concerning situation with Caleb Williams where, I mean, he just has to, because again, it's not just that you're 10 for 24, which was awful, but that he scrambled a ton in this game, which a few of them were by design, and I think they want to use him like that. But some of it was just purely competitiveness. Now, you love to see the competitiveness and the mobility. That's going to help for fantasy. But when you're 10 for 24 and you had a bunch of additional passes where you just didn't feel like anybody was open, I mean, this is a franchise-altering and potentially destroying game for the Bears. You've got to give some of these guys a chance. As you mentioned, it's always possible that Odunze and Allen are not what we want. It's virtually impossible that DJ Moore and Cole Kmet are not. You've got to throw them the ball. They get 5 targets in this game.
Yeah, so, I mean, I agree with you that he's got to make plays, etc. I don't want to double count because I feel confident in the take on Shane Waldron from a ton of contextual stuff, the JSN stuff and all of that, and what we saw early in the year and some of the stuff that I just referenced with the film people showing the etc. Caleb Williams looked good against the Rams. He looked better against the Panthers when he got to play them, and he looked good in London against the Jaguars. All 3 games, he has a traditional passer rating over 100. 2 of those games, he has the QBR over 80, which is like, those are really good NFL quarterback games. He's done that 3 straight games leading into this game. The fact that he would have a game like this where you can say, well, Shane Waldron's going to have some games, I don't want to double count because I had already made up in my mind that we're going to have more games like this in Caleb's rookie year. And I just want to get to the point where they fire these guys. And really, to me, I'm looking at 2025 because I don't think they're going to fire him at 4-3. It's really kind of unfortunate that he's played well enough that they've won so many games because these guys are going to play the whole year. Ideally, they fire him after the season. Maybe they don't. Maybe Shane Waldron's the offensive coordinator in 2025 as well. But for me, it's like when these games do pop up where I feel I don't think Caleb can overcome it all as a rookie. He's going to have some bad games, and I don't want to sit there and double count when the games pop up that I feel are on the coaching staff or should in a sample of a season some games should pop up like this that would be on the coaching staff. He's played really well at times as well. Those last 3 games.
So then we do have to let you go at this point, but to kind of for a fun rapid fire to finish. You're on the clock with the number 1 pick, Jaden Daniels or Caleb Williams?
I got to take Jaden Daniels. I think Jaden Daniels is going to be. I think he's the MVP right now, Sean. I've told you that repeatedly. So,
and just to be clear, though, you think that is more than just sort of a fleeting type of thing. That, I mean, to me, there's absolutely no question that if you had the first pick, you're
Jaden Daniels
sprinting. Yeah, you have the second pick. Is it Caleb Williams or Drake May?
I think I'm taking Caleb Williams because I still think I've seen enough, especially because I have issues with the coaching staff. I feel confident that the profile and all the things that we thought is going to shine through. I don't think he's a bust by any. I don't think we're anywhere near him being a bust. I think that's getting ahead of yourself, personally.
But you don't think Drake May has?
I don't think Drake May's done anything wrong. I think he's looked really good too. So it would be tricky because I think you feel good about May too. I think this is going to be a really good quarterback class. I think we're going to look back at this as being a very, very, and I'm excited about what it means because we need more good quarterback play. Because I think Bo Nix is, John, the way that
well, I was going to ask you if you were going to take Drake May, like with the number 3 pick, would it be Caleb Williams or Bo Nix?
Well, no, I think I would take May still. I think Nix to me would be like in the 4 discussion. A guy that we haven't talked about at all because we haven't seen him play at all, but we were really negative on Michael Penix. And just the way that you have to succeed in this NFL now to rip these types of throws, that he actually is willing to take some of the throws. I kind of feel like this NFL that I'm watching, I'm like, this is actually a landscape where Michael Penix could be successful as well.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the chicken or the egg element, and I have to tell you, I have not been impressed with the Huskies receivers. Right. Maybe it was Penix, right? If it was Penix. And again, some of that stuff is not going to show up in the charting exactly. Like if these guys are running bad routes and doing weird stuff, and then he's inaccurate on some of these throws, maybe it wasn't on him. So, and again, NFL scouts would tell you that it was Penix. And
this is going to be the best quarterback class in the last, I don't know, off the top of my head, the other really, really good quarterback classes. I don't feel like there's been any that have given us like 3 like perennial Pro Bowlers. There might be 5 in this class. Like I think this is the best in however many years, 20 years, I don't know, 40 years.
That would be exciting. JJ McCarthy, somebody else we're not huge on, given specifically the stats and the profile, is going to have Justin Jefferson. And, if you like him, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, and an elite schemer, wouldn't be surprised if his numbers are eventually fantastic as well. That'll do it for this episode of Stealing Bananas. I am Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, has been Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Signals, at Stealing Lines. Subscribe to the YouTube. Join us at RotoViz. Like and subscribe for the show, or like the show. Give us a rating and review. All those things help with the algorithm. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.